Hi, also, this is the Edexcel History A-Level Paper 3 content for agitation, protest and parliamentary reform in Britain, 1780 to 1928. I'm going to do the depth content, which consists of 5 topics in 5 separate videos I'll make. So radical reformers, Chartism, the CDAs, the WSPU and trade union militancy. We're going to start off with the radical reformers from 1790 to 1819. So the radical reformers has 3 main questions. So how significant was extra parliamentary protests from 1790 to 1819? How effective was the government's responses to the protest in the years to 1819? And what was the impact of the radical reformers themselves? So here are our first questions. So we have the London Corresponding Society, also abbreviated as the LCS, from 1792 to 93. The society was founded by Hardy in 1792, who was a shoemaker and supported by skilled craftsmen in London. He was strongly influenced by the SCI and the LCS promoted the twin causes of universal suffrage and the annual parliaments. Some members were keen on adopting issues in social and political reform, but Hardy and other leaders were reluctant to champion these causes, arguing that some of these reforms would come about natural consequences of parliamentary reform. The LCS worked to promote the political education of its members by publishing pamphlets promoting their views. Their aims were set out in key pamphlets issued in November 1792, the address of the LCS to the other societies in Great Britain. They explained their basic aims and made clear that their methods would be peaceful, intending to petition Parliament rather than organising potentially violent demonstrations. The organisation of the LCS marked a new departure for radical groups. The society never tried to limit its membership to any particular class. It adopted the slogan that our membership be unlimited and charged a very low subscription fee. It kept size of local associations deliberately small to enable all of its members to take part in discussions and debates. Pitt was worried by the structure of the LCS. He believed that the society was not so much a political organisation, but had become a military body. Government spies infiltrated the society, but reported that the LCS operated strictly within the law. Inevitably, there was backlash from the conservative groups against the LCS and the other radical organisations, especially as events in France moved from the moderate position of 1789 to more extreme activity from 1791 to 93. A number of loyalist societies were established, whose members were viewed radical as being disloyal to both the king and the country. The Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levelers was formed in 1792, and a network of these organisations grew up nationally. While the corresponding societies were largely supported by skilled workers, associate memberships was drawn almost exclusively from middle classes. The government welcomed the association movement and played its part by using the loyalist press to promote patriotic propaganda, by giving reformers secret help to associations, and by taking action against the reformers. We then have the Sparfield meetings of 1816, the government's determination to destroy reforming activity and the growth of national feeling during the Napoleonic War, and the effectively silenced Britain's radicalism in the early years of the 19th century. However, peace abroad wasn't accompanied by tranquility at home, and from the 1850s, Lord Liverpool's government faced a number of challenges to its authority. Compared with other parts of the country, London had remained relatively quiet after 1850. The more radical groups were divided on their aims and methods, while support was growing from the moderate reforming programme of middle-class leaders such as Sir Francis Burdett. Reform meetings in London during the early months of 1816 proved uncontroversial and were concerned as much with the relief of the poor as with political reform. The following of Thomas Spence were unhappy with the moderate stance and planned a meeting in East London, which they hoped would lead to a violent rioting and disorder. Radical leader Henry Hunt was invited to address the meeting, called to take place at Sparfield in East London in November. The crowd of 10,000 people was the largest gathering that London had seen since the anti-Catholic Gordon riots of 1780. The meeting's aims were not contentious. Hunt was asked to present a London petition to the Prince Regent urging him to reform Parliament. In his speech, Hunt championed the moral force behind the petition, but came dangerously close to suggesting the use of physical force if the petitioners demands weren't met. Hunt was not received by Prince Regent, and a second protest meeting was called for December 2nd. Once again, Hunt was due to speak, but he was preempted by Spencermans, who stirred up the sections of the crowd and urged them to take a course of direct action. A number of people left the meeting, looted a number of gunsmiths, and set off siege to the Tower of London and the Royal Exchange. Had they been successful, they might have attempted a coup against the government, but the quick action of the Lord Mayor of London and his force of contestables dispersed the rioters and arrested their leader. The trial of ringleaders in 1817 exposed the role of government informers and spies in Sparkfield affair. The defence was able to prove a government informer named Castle had encouraged the riot, and that he had duped the ringleaders into taking extreme action. In the light of this revelation, the jury acquitted all defendants. Sparkfield now exposed many of the difficulties faced by radical farmers in the post-war years, and the use of government spies and agent provocateurs made it almost impossible to outwit the forces of order, who were usually well informed about intended courses of action. The division between these, who supported peaceful protests, and others who tended towards a violent action made unification impossible. We then have the Pentridge Rising in 1817. So, Bamford was correct in his belief that the government had infiltrated radical movements and were feeding information about their intentions back to London. Liverpool's government had been established a committee of secrecy even, which operated a substantial network of spies. The information that they had gathered enabled them to be prepared for outbreaks of violence or rebellious activity. The significance of the spies was highlighted in the Pentridge Rising of 1817. In the early months of 1817, a number of revolutionary activists held a meeting in Pentridge where they discussed plans for an insurrection. In May, they were joined by a Londoner who called himself Oliver. Oliver persuaded the meeting that the radicals in London were preparing an uprising in the capital for June 9th, which would be supported by similar action throughout the country. None of this was true. Oliver was in fact a former convict called Richard, and he was paid by Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary. Not only did he spy on the radical groups, but in this instance he acted as an agent provocateur, intending to lead the Pentridge activists into illegal and treasonable activities. The activists were convinced by Oliver's reports, and on the 9th of June, their leader, Brandreth, led 300 men towards Nottingham, intended to seize the city. Once again, the system of spies proved effective. The rebels were intercepted by the regiment of soldiers before they could reach the city. Many men fled, but 80 were arrested. A week after attempting rising, the Leeds Mercury published a detailed investigation that exposed Oliver's role in the rising. Its editor, Baines, blamed the government rather than the activists for the whole affair. Those who believed the castle's involvement in Sparfields was an isolated incident now realised that the minister had been using such tactics for some years. Public revulsion had no effect on the trial or the ringleaders. 14 men were transported, and Brandreth, along with 2 others, were hanged and beheaded in public. Now have the Peterloo event of 1819. So this is the action taken by the government in 1816 and 17, coupled with some improvements in the economy, meant that radical events were dampened down for a brief period. 1818, Henry Hunt stood for election to Parliament. But his advocacy of Parliament reform was unpopular with the electorate, and he was soundly defeated. Radical clubs and societies remained in existence, and although the Political Register ceased publication in 1817, after Cobbett fled to the USA, a flourishing radical press continued to argue the case for reform. The last significant protest of these years took place, not in London, but in Manchester. The city and its mill towns provided fertile ground for working-class radicalism to flourish. There were a long tradition of trade unionism in the region, and large textile mills employing hundreds of people had given rise to a working-class identity that was separate from their middle-class employers. Working-class activity in Manchester was exemplified by March of the Blanketeers in 1817. The Blanketeers were textile workers who intended to march to London to petition the Regent to take steps to improve the cotton trade. A crowd of around 10,000 saw off some 300 marches from Manchester, but they did not get very far. At Stockport, 6 miles south of Manchester, the local yeomanry arrested many of the marchers and dispersed most of the rest, and the remaining Blanketeers failed to get beyond Maxfield in Cheshire. Radical activity in Manchester continued to fluctuate in line with economic conditions, and the downturn in the textile industry in 1818 gave a rise to sustained campaign of mass meeting and demand for parliamentary reform. Radical activists decided to stage a meeting in Manchester in 1819 and invited Henry Hunt to address the gathering. The meeting was held on the 16th of August at St. Peter's Field. It attracted 80,000 men, women and children, perhaps the largest crowd that had ever gathered in Britain. Most came from Manchester itself, but numbers were swelled by the contingents from surrounding towns, including Oldham, Stockport and Ashton under. The careful organisation of different groups was explained by the radical leader Bamford in his description of the preparations made in Middleton, a cotton town outside Manchester. The events in St. Peter's Field provoked widespread national revulsion, leading to several outbreaks of sporadic rioting and further growth of political unions. Peterloo, so-called in the mocking irony of Battle of Waterloo in 1815, soon entered national folklore as symbol of savage repression of working-class people by authoritarian government. This historian, Gash, had taken a different view of the events in 1816 and the government policies as its whole, basically saying that it was because of Peterloo's uncharacteristic that it achieved notoriety. The responsibility for Peterloo lay not with the government but the Manchester magistrates. They had become alarmed at the growing popularity of training by the reform groups, and the use of flags and banners gave an increasingly military favour to the protest meetings. The sheer size of the Petersfield meeting worried them. Had they arrested Hunt before or after the meeting, then deaths and injuries might as well have been prevented. As it was, they and the amateur yeomanry had all been gripped by a sense of panic. We now have the extent of the success of extra-parliamentary protests by 1819. Those the government's response to radicals. So they used limited forces at their command, such as volunteer yeomanry, who were deployed at disastrous consequences at Peterloo. They could also call on local regiments where necessary. In a pre-railway age, it was difficult to move large numbers of troops with any speed to potential trouble spots. The vital role played by the magistrates explaining the government's actions after Peterloo, when they congratulated the Manchester justices for their prompt action in dispersing the crowd at St. Peter's Field. To have done otherwise would have lost the government's much support from the magistrates in the country as a whole. The government used a large network of spies who infiltrated radical organisations and reported back to them. Their information enabled the government to take preemptive action to deal with the unrest. This was clearly shown in the attempted rising to fail of the Pentridge Rise in 1817, when the spy Oliver played an important role as an agent. Moreover, in the years 1793 to 1815, Britain was at war with the revolutionary and Napoleonic France. It was therefore essential for the government to promote a sense of national unity and to suppress any internal dissent. Reform was often equated with revolution, which made the task of radical movement all the more difficult. While radicalism was a powerful force at the time, a number of patriotic and national movements, such as the associations and the volunteers, attracted far more volunteers. Add to this, the radical protests were also impossible to achieve. 30 years of radical activity and protest, therefore, appeared to have achieved nothing concrete. And in this sense, extra-parliamentary protest appeared unsuccessful. None of the specific aims that united radicals, especially their support of some measures of parliamentary reform, had been achieved. However, this does not mean that radical protest was a complete failure. Much had been achieved in long-term organisation and in political education of the working class as a whole. These developments were to have a long-term effect, especially in the 1830s and 40s. We then had the extent of radical success, so I'll try and sum this down a little bit. So, in the 1780s, Raikes founded a Sunday school in Gloucester. Many parents sent their kids to the school, where they were educated to read and write. Raikes' innovation was taken up by many nonconformist groups, especially the Methodists. Recent research estimated that in 1820, 670,000 children were being educated in day schools, with further 500,000 in Sunday schools. Growing literacy meant that many families were able to access newspapers and pamphlets, and this was reflected in the changes in the newspaper industry. The 18th century saw a major growth in the number of papers printed annually, rising from 1 million in 1619 to 14 million by 1785. Pitt feared that the large number of illiterate working class men would gain access to the radical printed propaganda. And thus between 1789 and 1815, the duty of newspapers rose from 1.5D to 4D. This did not halt the growth of national and local newspapers, some of which were subsidised by the government. The Tory-supporting Manchester Herald had a healthy circulation in Manchester and nearby towns, and the independent but radical Leeds Mercury had a circulation of 3,000 by 1800. The post-war reform movement differed significantly from that which had been active in the 1790s. The early reformers operated through the corresponding societies and political clubs and spread their message through pamphlets and discussions. Despite the government's concern, radicals as a whole were interested in only issues such as equal rights and parliamentary reform. They were not prepared to back up their demands by mass action or their use of force. This explained This explained the membership of the early reform movements. The SCI drew much of its support from the middle class, especially the industrialists and factory owners, and the LCS was backed by the skillful artisans in London. Their programs held little attraction for the mass of the working class and agricultural classes. The reform programs that developed from 1812 differed from those of the 1790s in both the nature and extent of their support. Middle-class support remained strong, especially from those whose businesses were active and had suffered from during the war, and the skilled and literate working class maintained their interest in reform. However, the dynamics of radicalism had changed over time. 1790s, the unskilled working class in industrial towns and cities had begun to organise themselves into trade unions until they were suppressed by the Combination Acts of 1799. And the 1800s, the French War drew to a close. Interest in reform revived even, but the workers were to become more interested in political reform. Many Hampton clubs were established, especially in northern textile towns, and soon they'd become large and committed memberships. Radicalism of the 1790s had been dominated by people in organisation based in London. This situation was reversed in the post-war years, as northern radicalism took the lead in organising protests. So we now have the failures of British radicalism. So despite growing importance, post-war radicalism faced two serious problems. The first was that no national figure was able to prepare to take up position of leadership. Cobbett's role as that of journalist and propagandist, not an active agitator, and the powerful oratory of men such as Henry Hunt was not transformed into political action. Second issue was that post-war reformers faced the classic dilemma of those seeking change in society, one that was to cause problems for the Chartist movement in the 1840s. Reformers were split between those like Cobbett who wanted to achieve change through moral force and persuasion, and those who believed it was only through the violence or physical force that radicalists could achieve their aims. The difficulties were compounded by the government determination, as shown in the 1790s, to stand against the reforms and maintain law and order. For 30 years, politics and society in Britain were strongly affected by the French Revolution and its aftermath. French armies undertook to export the principles of freedom and equality to other countries in Europe, and Britain wasn't immune to the attraction of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. 1919 to 99, radicalism was largely the preserve of the middle classes. Even some Whigs jumped on the reform bandwagon with the formation of the Friends of the People, an aristocrat-exclusive and short-lived organisation that called for parliamentary reform. From 1810, the reform climate changed in both nature and extent. Radicals were better organised than before, and the idea of reform was supported by both people drawn from all social classes. Most organisations still aimed for parliamentary reform, but some aimed at the revolutionary seizure of the state. Economic difficulties of the post-war years were overcome and gave way to stability and the growth in the years to 1830. Although political agitation had helped to calm down after Peterloo, radicalism still remained as powerful influence, especially amongst the working classes. We then have the second question. So how effective was the government's response to protest in the years to 1819? The trial of the leader of the LCS and the suspension of habeas corpus in 1794, a royal proclamation of the 1792 against seditious writings was followed by a more direct action against reformers. In 1793, the LCS and the revived SCI sent delegates to a meeting in Edinburgh to agree on the calling of a national reform convention with the sole intention of pressing for parliamentary reform. The government stalled this meeting as a potential subversive, sent in troops and arrested several of the delegates. Despite this setback, the Reform Societies regrouped and early in 1794 announced that the calling of a national reform convention. Timing was unfortunate due to Britain being at war with France, and there was very little sympathy for reformers who had appeared to be dividing the nation at the time. Armed with the information provided by their network spies, the government arrested several key of the leaders of both groups and charged them with high treason. At the same time, Parliament, promoted by Pitt, suspended corpus. This allowed the government time to interview the accused and prepare a case against them. Government had become deeply concerned at the growth of the LCS, and whilst it only reached 5,000 members, its message had reached a large and sympathetic audience. Pitt overestimated the size of the power of the LCS, and society kept its meetings deliberately small to encourage the involvement of every member. So more groups were formed as its membership grew. The government was convinced that the organisation was rapidly expanding, especially as Hardy declared that its membership would be unlimited. Trials took place at the end of 1794. The government was unable to present a convincing case to the courts to support the high charge of treason. Evidence produced to support this claim was invented, and the jury refused to accept evidence and acquitted all defendants. Evidence of 1794 showed how seriously the government took threats of domestic unrest and opposition. 1795, Pitt had proposed some limited measures of parliamentary reform, but revolution the French were convinced of necessity to maintain stability at home, even if it meant imposing substantial limits of personal freedom. We then have the Treason Act of 1795 and the Seditious Meeting Act in 1795. So during this time, war, distress and growing unrest was occurring because of the French War, which had dislocated Britain's overseas trade, leading to rapidly rising unemployment in industrial towns. These difficulties were compounded by poor harvest and the inevitable rise of food prices. When stones were thrown at George III's coach, the government used the event as a pretext to take strong action. Failure of the 1794 even treason trials had persuaded ministers to amend the treason law in order to strengthen their powers against radicalism. The existing law against treason made it impossible to convict the LCS leaders, and the government decided to extend the definition of treason to go beyond simply treasonable actions. The Treason Acts made it offensive to kill or even harm the king. More ominously for reformers, it was also any intention to intimidate or overawe either houses of parliament, meant that anybody outside parliament who called for parliamentary reform could be charged with treason. Treason Act was accompanied by a Seditious Meeting Act passed in the same year. The act restricted the size of public meetings to 50 unless they were approved in advance by the magistrates. Large outdoor meetings of thousands of people had been taking place in early 1790s, but these were now effectively banned. Radical activity rapidly diminished, and this was supplanted by many years by development of patriotic feeling as a long result of the years against the war with France. Such an environment, there were very little support for reforming ideas, which carried with them more than a whiff of treachery. Leading radicals were silenced or had escaped. Between 1792 to 1802, Paine lived in France, where he continued to produce reformist pamphlets. His age of reason attacked the errors and corruption of the Christian churches and the promoted ideas and values of the natural religion, or deism. His ideas founded little favour with his target audience in Britain, France, or the USA, where he spent the last years of his life. Gagging Acts of 1817. 1815, the war with the French came to an end. British forces had achieved a great victory and emerged as the leading power in Europe. However, peace abroad wasn't accompanied by peace at home, and in the years 1819, Lord Liverpool's government faced a number of serious challenges to its authorities. The return of the peace did not lead to an immediate improvement in the country's economy. Harvests were poor, and after a brief post-war boom, the economy fell into depression. Rising unemployment was made worse by the speedy demobilization of 300,000 troops. The government did little to alleviate distress, clinging to the laissez-faire belief that the economy would revive in time without the need of government intervention. Radical activities in the years 1815 to 17 led ministers to believe that the existence of broad national revolutionary conspiracies. The work at the Hampton Clubs, the Spenceans' harebrained attempt at revolution at Sparfield, the attack of the Prince Regent and the Blanketeers all seem to be linked a series of events that would cause a general insurrection. The view was reinforced by the information fed to the Home Secretary by the government's own spy network in the aftermath of the Sparfields. Therefore, the government decided to take firm action. During 1817, the Liverpool's government passed 3 measures designed to combat radical activity. The Treason Act was due to lapse on the death of George III, but the attacks on Regent persuaded Parliament to make this act a permanent measure. Corpus was suspended for all those suspected of treasonable activities. This measure gave ministers time to prepare a case against radicals, but also took leading radicals such as Bamford out of circulation for several months before they were released without charge. Seditious meetings of 1817 built on the terms of the 1795 measure. Justices of the peace were given the power to attend any public meeting and could disperse it if they were considered it to be unlawful. Societies and organisations whose members were required to swear a secret oath were banned outright. The government demonstrated its fear of the Spenceans by suppressing all Spencean clubs by name. Like the 1795 Acts, the 1817 measures quickly became known as the Gagging Acts. They succeeded in their aims of quelling unrest in the short term, especially in London. While most of their terms elapsed in 1818, radical activity simply sprang up once more. We then have the 6 Acts of 1819. So because of the St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819, the government were afraid of this happening again, as Peterloo appeared to the government to be well organised and a threatening action, especially because of the disciplined crowds who had marched to the meeting with almost military efficiency. The government was determined to restore and maintain order, so they met at the end of 19, and Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, aimed at preventing similar disturbances, so this led to the 6 Act being passed into the law. One of the most important acts was the Unlawful Drilling Act. Many of those who attended Peterloo were known to have been practicing marching and drilling on the moors outside of Manchester. Bamford suggested that there was nothing sinister in these activities, but that the organisers of the meeting wanted to disarm their critics by a show of cleanliness, sobriety and decorum. The government took a different view, believing that the frequent practicing of marches could be seen as training for future insurrection. The Act banned unlawful military-style drilling with harsh penalty of transportation imposed on any lawbreakers. The Act was accompanied by the Seizure of Arms Act, which empowered magistrates to enter any property where they suspected arms being stored, and the Misdemeanors Act, reducing the ability to arrest any person from being granted bail. Liverpool's government wanted to prevent any further huge radical demonstrations on the scale of Peterloo. The Seditious Meeting Prevention Act revived the terms of the 1795 and 1817 Act, many of which had been allowed to lapse. Public meetings were once again limited to 50 people and could be conducted at a level of parish only. This measure was a significant attempt to curtail individual freedom and was strongly opposed by the Whig opposition and eventually repealed in 1824. The government knew that radicalism was strongly underpinned and its influence by its own press. The Criminal Libel Act in 1819 proved to be inefficient in operation, as it introduced the death penalty of transportation for libellous writings. More important was the Newspapers and Stamp Duty Act in 1819. For publications that had pay, the stamp duty was extended, and the amount to be paid was increased substantially. The effect of this measure was to reduce the number of newspapers and pamphlets that could be published profitably. The government acknowledged how seriously they viewed the radical threat to the national stability. The preamble to the Acts declared that every meeting for radical reform is an overt action of treasonable conspiracy against the king's government. The 6 Acts had desired effect to not repeat another crisis of Peterloo. So we then have the third question, which was, what was the impact of the radical reformers themselves? So we have Thomas Paine and the Rights of Man, John Cartwright and the Hampton Clubs, William Cobbett and the Political Register, and Henry Hunt as a radical orator. Have Paine and the Rights of Man. Paine was one of the most influential radicals of the 18th century. He welcomed the French Revolution of 1789, hoping that it would lead to a democratic system of governments for France. He opposed the conservative ideas put forward by Edmund Burke in Reflections on the Revolution in France of 1790 and recorded in the forms of the rights of man. Burke's open opposition to the French Revolution sparked a period of vigorous debate between his supporters and opponents. The most significant response, and one that caught public imagination, was made by Paine. Unlike other pamphleteers, Paine wrote in a style that was accessible to most people, not simply the educated elite. His Rights of Man was the most successful attempt to counter Burke's argument and reached a large audience in both Britain and France. Instead, he argued that the rights bestowed by the government could be removed, making a mockery of the idea of the fundamental and inalienable rights. Instead, he declared that since all men were born equal in the sight of God, they must therefore be endowed with the same human and political rights. Any system of government that was based on hereditary rule, such as monarchy in the House of Lords, and thus was unnatural and contrasted the rights of man. For Paine, the government depended not on the rights, divine or hereditary rights, but on the consent of all men equally. Arguments such as these were very easy to understand and explain the success of Paine's writings. Equally straightforward was his proposals for a wholesale reform of the British system of the government, with the establishment of a republic in which all adult males would have the vote. Government would thus be carried out in interest of all, not just of the privileged elite. In Part 2, Paine outlined a comprehensive plan for practical application of his interests of all, not just of a privileged elite. So amongst his proposals were the creation of National Democratic Assembly, abolition of aristocracy and its titles, establishment of a system of education, a reduction in taxes on the poor, and a progressive tax to be levied in all land. In many ways, these ideas were more revolutionary than those being promoted across the English. The government did not take action against Paine over the publication of The Rights of Man in Part 1, even though it reached a wide audience in 3 years and sold some 200,000 copies. Ministers were concerned that the price of Part 2 was within the reach of most people and decided to suppress this message. 1792, a royal proclamation was issued against seditious writings, which had been printed and published to leave Britain for France. So many saw this proclamation aimed at Paine, who wisely decided to go to France. We now have John Cartwright and the Hampton Club. So the suppression of the LCS and the similar organisations, British radicalism had lost its sole national organisation, proved difficult to fill the gaps in the early 1800s. Enthusiasm for parliamentary reform had abated, and Parliament was never likely to even consider the issue of reform as long as the French War continued. Leaderless and without direction, British radicalism was virtually extinguished for the early years of the 19th century. From 1812, new life was breathed into reform movement from an unlikely source. Cartwright possessed radical credentials stretching back to 1770s, when he first published a pamphlet calling for universal suffrage. In 1812, he formed the Hampton Club in London, named after John Hampden, one of the leading opponents of Charles I, and it limited its membership to a very small number of middle-class aristocrat men. English Civil War. The club was an exclusive affair. Its high annual subscription of 2 guineas, 1812, Cartwright toured the industrial districts of the North and the Midlands, where he first saw the widespread poverty and the poor living conditions that existed in cotton towns. He became convinced that the only remedy for socialism was the parliamentary reform, and from 1816 encouraged the creation of Hampton Clubs. These were very different from London clubs. Membership was open to all who could pay a weekly subscription of 1 penny, and frequent meetings took place to discuss the national news and debate political issues. In many ways, the Hampton Clubs filled the gap left by the demise of the LCS, which had been disbanded in 1794 and formally outlawed by the government in 1799. The rapid growth in its popularity of the Hampton Clubs persuaded Cartwright and others to invite local delegates to plenary meetings in 1817 to set semesters of policy. They wanted Parliament to introduce reforms, agree on the universal suffrage and annual parliaments, and approve a broad strategy of petitioning. Although the Hampton Clubs worked strictly within the law, following Cartwright's maxim to hold fast by the laws, local authorities were not convinced of the club's peaceful intentions. Many used any excuse to arrest political reformers. Magistrates in Manchester and the surrounding towns employed spies who attended meetings and filed reports, which usually exaggerated the threat posed by the radicals. Acting on these reports, magistrates arrested club members, charging them with serious attending seditious meetings. Bamford and other local leaders were arrested in 1817 and sent to prisons in London, only to be released without charges a month later. Actions such as these by the local and national officials meant that the Hampton clubs were unable to act effectively after 1817. So Cobbett and the political registers. Cobbett was... He wrote many pamphlets against the French wars and widely circulated in the USA and Britain. 1800, Cobbett returned to England, where the government offered him some lucrative opportunities, but Cobbett turned them down because he liked to remain independent. He established his register, which soon became the leading independent of partial news, which was formed in 1805. And from 1806, Cobbett became increasingly radical in outlook. In that year, he stood for Parliament in Honiton, but was not elected. The experience brought home to him just how corrupt British electoral system was, and thereafter he began to promote the cause of parliamentary reform. 1809, some soldiers stationed at Ely in Cambridgeshire mutilated because they had not been paid. They were court-martialed, and 5 ringleaders were sentenced to 500 lashes each. Cobbett published a number of articles in successive editions of the Register, which vigorously denounced the cruel and inhumane punishment. The government used Cobbett's article against him. In 1810, he was tried for seditious libel against the armed forces and was sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment. 1816, Cobbett decided to reach a much wider audience. The Political Register was a very popular journal, but it cost 1 shilling, which included a newspaper tax. It's beyond its means of the working class leaders who had to club together to purchase a copy. Cobbett decided to issue a single sheet of Register for just 2 pence, which meant that the paper would not have to pay the high newspaper duty set by the government. The first edition of this new publication was a huge success, and by the end of 1817, 200,000 copies had been printed and circulated. We finally have the role of Henry Hunt as a radical orator. In the years 1800 to 20, Cobbett was the most influential radical journalist in Britain. His writings reached a very wide audience, and he did much to spread radical ideas amongst the working class. When he first produced his 2-penny Register, Hunt was coming to forefront of radical politics, using his remarkable powers of oratory in addressing meetings throughout the country. Hunt was a gentleman farmer from Wiltshire. He supported the political and social outlook of the middle class, giving unqualified support to Pitt's domestic and foreign policies. His attitudes changed drastically in 1799 to 1800, when he was imprisoned for a time for defying the orders of the commander of his local militia. While he was in prison, he came into contact with some radicals who had been imprisoned for political activities. 1810, Hunt had begun to gain a reputation as a brilliant orator, making powerful speeches at elections meetings through the West Country. He failed in his bid to be elected for Bristol in 1812 and moved to London for the following years. By 1812, he established himself as one of the most important leaders of British radicalism, thanks in his part to many speeches opposing property taxes in the Corn War of 1815. Hunt's influence was seen as the most clearly at Sparfield meeting in 1816, as he had given their support to household suffrage as one of the main aims. At Sparfield, Hunt proposed universal suffrage for the first time at a mass meeting. He noted in his memoirs that the effect of his speech was electrifying. 1819, Hunt accepted an invitation to address the mass meeting planned at St. Peter's Field in 1816 in Manchester. He insisted that the meeting would be peaceful and tightly organised. Hunt intended to urge the meeting to refuse to pay taxes and to secure parliamentary reform by the use of numerical force. Magistrates feared that Hunt's ability to influence public meetings would lead to violence and sent in the Manchester Yeomanry to arrest him. He was charged with promoting seditious conspiracy, and in the end, in 1820, he was jailed for 2.5 years. Much of the credit for the growth of British radicalism in the early century must go to both Cobbett and Hunt. He was able to articulate very effective working class grievances and aspirations through media and print, but from 1815 it was Hunt who was seen as the champion of the people of their interests. His trademark white top hat made him very instantly recognisable, and this was a vital factor in sustaining British radicalism because of his universal suffrage inspiring people to work throughout the country.
So that is just British radicalism done. Stay tuned for part 2 for Chartism.